For roughly 400 years, European ships came to West African coast, bought what they wanted and then sailed away. They built forts, they anchored trading oaks in the creeks, they bought gold, ivory, enslaved people, and later palm oil. But beyond the reach of the guns on the shore, African rulers remained in charge. Then, within about 20 years, that old arrangement collapsed. European government that had shown little desire to rule the interior suddenly raced to claim almost the entire continent. By 1900, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent African states. So, what changed? Why the trade that had worked for centuries suddenly seems insufficient? And why was Britain, a government that has often regarded West Africa as an expensive nuisance, pulled into the race? The first thing to understand is that European restraint before the 1880s was not generosity, it was practicality. Disease was one reason. Malaria and yellow fever made long European expeditions into the interior extremely dangerous, as we saw in the story of the white man's grave. African strength was another. The interior contained organized kingdoms and states with armies, political systems, and the ability to defend their territory. And there was a third reason that may have mattered most in daily business. Conquest was unnecessary. African merchants brought goods to the coast. Europeans could buy slaves, gold, ivory, or oil without paying to occupy and administer the land that produced them. Trade reached the beach, so Europe stayed at the beach. Britain especially preferred this arrangement. During much of the 19th century, the British government did not want a large territory empire in West Africa. Formal rule required soldiers, officials, roads, salaries, and a budget. The treasury disliked the cost, and many politicians saw little reasons to take it on. British merchants already dominated much of the trade around the lower Niger and the oil rivers. From London's point of view, why pay to govern a coast when British firms already control so much of its commerce? So, Britain relied on what historians called informal empire. That sounds abstract, but the practice was straightforward. Keep a consul on the coast, keep a few gunboats nearby, sign treaties that protect trade and extend influence. If the ruler threatens British interests, apply pressure, but avoid the permanent responsibility of governing the country. Influence without full administration, that was the bargain. The difference between influence and formal rule was not just a matter of flags. Informal influence allowed Britain to become involved only when a specific interest was threatened. A consul could mediate a dispute, a naval officer could pressure a ruler, a merchant could ask for a treaty protecting his access to trade. Former empire was permanent. Once Britain declared a territory belonged under its authority, it had to decide who would enforce laws, who would collect revenues, how resistance would be answered, and what happened when two African states inside the claim went to war. Every answer required people and money. That is why officials in London could support aggressive actions in one port while rejecting responsibility for the whole region behind it. They wanted the ability to influence events without accepting every consequence of rule. The scramble made that middle position harder to maintain. A rival power could turn a trading relationship into a territorial claim before Britain had decided whether the place was worth governing. Britain already possessed Sierra Leone, forts on the Gold Coast and Lagos, which became a British colony in 1861. Even these limited possessions were often viewed in London as troublesome expenses. A parliamentary committee has recommended that Britain reduce its West African commitments rather than enlarge them. William Gladstone's government was deeply suspicious of costly imperial adventures. And there is a revealing detail here. African rulers sometimes asked Britain for formal protection, and London refused them. British officials understood that protections created obligation and obligation cost money. So when the scramble began, Britain was not confidently following a plan to seize Africa. It was reacting to the fear that other power might seize the place where British trade was already strong. So, why did the wider European race begin? Historians have debated that question for more than a century, and a good explanation has to hold several causes together. One was economic pressure. The 1870s and 1880s brought falling prices and shrinking profits for much of European industry. Confidence in free trade began to weaken. Governments raised tariffs to protect their own producers, and merchants worried that a rival country would close its markets against them. In that climate, colonies began to look like protection. If your country ruled a territory, its market could easily be closed to your goods. Its raw materials could not easily be taxed away by a rival. Ownership appeared to offer security in an increasingly competitive world. That helps explain the scramble, but it is not enough to say that Europe simply wanted raw materials. European merchants had obtained African products for centuries without governing the people who produced them. Something else had changed: the fear that trade itself could be lost. This distinction helps us to avoid a common oversimplification. Europe factories certainly wanted markets and materials, but if raw materials alone caused a colonial conquest, Europe would have occupied West Africa centuries earlier. Gold, ivory, enslaved people, and palm oil had all reached European ships without direct territorial rule. The new pressure came from an international economy becoming more defensive. Protectionism meant governments could place tariff walls around trade. A merchant who depended on access to a foreign control market could suddenly face restrictions designed to favor his rival. Territory began to look like an insurance policy. That does not mean every colony later became profitable or that every minister possessed a clear economic plan. It means commercial insecurity changed the calculation. Conquest, once dismissed as an unnecessary expense, could now be defended as protection against exclusion. Strategy also mattered. The Suez Canal opened in 1869 and shortened the sea road between Europe and India. For Britain, the canal became a vital link in an imperial system that stretched far beyond Africa. When political turmoil struck Egypt, Britain occupied the country in 1882 to protect the canal. That decision had consequences across the continent. Historians Ronald Robinson and John Gallagher later argued that British expansion was driven less by a simple appetite for African wealth than by the defense of a strategic route, especially the road to India. In their interpretation, crises on the edges of empire pulled Britain forward. Other historians place greater weight on economics. Both explanations reveal part of the picture. The historical disagreements matter because each explanation changed the kind of empire we see. If economic alone drove the scramble, the story becomes a planned search for profits. If strategy was decisive, Britain appeared to be protecting routes and reacting to crises. If you focus on agents on the ground, expansion can begin through decisions that government did not fully control. And if rivalry is central, a territory may be claimed less for what it contained than for the fear of seeing another flag there. The evidence does not require us to choose one. A merchant's demand, a soldier's ambition, a strategic anxiety, and a government fear of national humiliation could converge on the same decision. That is one reason the scramble accelerated so quickly. Different motives created the same pressure to move. Then there were the people making decisions on the ground. Imperial expansion was not always directed neatly from London, Paris, or Berlin. Traders, soldiers, explorers, and consuls in Africa often moved first. They signed treaties, occupied a town, or announced a claim, then asked their government to support what they had already done. The center could hesitate while the agent created facts on the ground. That is important because it means the scramble was not one perfectly organized European plan. It was also a collection of personal ambition, local crises, and hasty decisions that government became afraid to reverse. There was no single day on which Europe decided as one united body to conquer Africa. The change emerged through accumulation. One officer moved beyond his instructions. One rival raised the flag. One company requested protection. One government feared that withdrawing would look weak. Each decision narrowed the options for the next. By the time the politicians recognized the scale of the commitment, scattered actions had begun to look like national policy. Above everything ran rivalry. France had been defeated by Germany in 1871 and looked overseas for renewed status and power. Germany was newly united, economically strong, and increasingly unwilling to watch other empires claim the world. Britain feared that rival might block the trade routes and markets it had long taken for granted. Every power watched the others. The logic became dangerous. If one country claimed a territory, the other felt pressure to move before everything was gone. A place that had seemed unnecessary one year would become essential the next, simply because a rival wanted it. Pride mattered, fear mattered, so did the belief that hesitation meant permanent exclusion. Economics, strategy, rivalry, and the ambition of agents on the ground did not compete as separate explanations. They often pushed in the same direction at the same time. But a race still needs a starting signal. In Africa, the spark came from the Congo. King Leopold II ruled Belgium, a relatively small European country, but his personal ambition was enormous. He did not initially move into the Congo as the head of a Belgian colonial project. He acted as a private monarch, pursuing an estate of his own. He wrapped that ambition in the language of exploration, science, humanitarianism, and the campaign against slavery. Then, he employed Henry Morton Stanley, one of the most famous explorers of the age, to build stations and gather treaties along the Congo River. France responded by sending Pierre de Brazza to secure territory on the northern bank. Portugal asserted an older claim at the river's mouth. Suddenly, the vast Congo basin was becoming the scene of overlapping European claims. The sight of Leopold building a private empire alarmed the other powers. If the king of a small country could secure the heart of the continent by moving quickly, what might everyone else lose by waiting? The scramble began to feel like panic. That panic changed the meaning of territory. For British merchants, the lower Niger had been a commercial route. Now it became a position that France or Germany might take. A trading interest had to be defended as a territorial claim because trade without a flag would be shut out by someone else's flag. The same British government that had repeatedly avoided new responsibilities began to see inactions as the greater risk. This did not make Britain enthusiastic about conquest. It made Britain afraid of being excluded, and fear can move a reluctant empire very quickly. We should also be clear about what was missing from Europe's calculations. The continent was not empty land waiting for flags. It contained states, armies, trading systems, and rulers pursuing their own political goals. Any European claim on a map still had to confront the people living there. That is why the scramble produced treaties, alliances, resistance, and war. Africans were not standing still while Europeans decided their future. In West Africa, the next phase was centered on the Niger. France was advancing towards the river from Senegal. Germany was about to enter the colonial contest with startling speed. African rulers were weighing foreign offers, resistance armies, and choosing among dangerous options. Britain had spent much of the century refusing to rule. Now, it began to fear that if it did not claim the Niger, someone else would. And in the next episode, that fear becomes a race to claim the whole of Africa, and subsequently, the beginning of the making of Nigeria.